Picture a German Panzer commander standing upright in the open hatch of his Panzer IV, hand raised to signal his column forward, mouth open mid-command, when suddenly his eyes lock onto the sky instead of the road ahead, and in that single frozen heartbeat, the order dies in his throat because he has just heard the sound every Panzer crew in France learned to fear more than any artillery barrage ever fired at them: the low, growling snarl of an American fighter-bomber engine, and within seconds his tank, his crew, and his column would either scatter into the ditches and hedgerows or be turned into twisted, burning scrap metal scattered across a French country road. This is the story of how, by the summer of 1944, the elite tank crews of Nazi Germany, men who had conquered Poland, France, and pushed deep into Russia, who had faced Soviet artillery barrages so intense they shook the earth for miles, came to fear something entirely different. Not the shells screaming down from distant guns, but the silent, sudden death that dropped from the clouds above them, a fear so deep that it would reshape German tactical doctrine, force armored divisions to move only under cover of darkness, and ultimately contribute to one of the most devastating military collapses of the entire Second World War. To understand why fighter bombers became more terrifying to German tank crews than artillery, we first need to understand the psychology of fear on the battlefield, because artillery, for all its destructive power, followed patterns that experienced soldiers learned to read and survive. A barrage announced itself with the distant thud of guns firing, giving crews precious seconds to seek cover, and once shells began landing, veteran soldiers could often judge by the sound and rhythm whether the barrage was walking toward them or away, whether it was a full bombardment or a ranging shot, and critically, artillery could not chase a moving target with precision. A tank column on the move, spread out and mobile, could often escape the worst of a barrage simply by continuing to advance. But fighter bombers changed the entire equation because they did not fire blindly at map coordinates. They hunted, they had eyes, they could see a column of vehicles crawling along a road, identify individual tanks, trucks, and half-tracks, and then dive with terrifying precision to destroy them one by one. And worse, they struck without the warning that artillery provided. A pilot could approach from altitude, cut his engine into a shallow dive, and be releasing rockets or firing his cannons before the men below even registered the danger, turning what should have been a routine road march into a massacre in the span of 30 seconds. And this unpredictability, this sense of being hunted by an intelligent, seeing enemy, rather than simply being in the wrong place during a random bombardment, is what broke the nerve of even hardened Panzer veterans. The aircraft responsible for this transformation in German fear were primarily two remarkable machines: the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Hawker Typhoon, both of which had originally been designed with different roles in mind but evolved into devastating tank killers as the war progressed. The P-47, nicknamed the Jug for its bulky, barrel-like fuselage, was originally conceived as a high-altitude escort figure, but its rugged construction, powerful radial engine, and heavy armament made it perfectly suited for the punishing work of low-level ground attack armed with .850 caliber machine guns capable of shredding lightly armored vehicles and unprotected crew members, and later equipped to carry rockets and bombs. The Thunderbolt could absorb tremendous battle damage and still return its pilots safely home, a durability that meant American pilots could press attacks at dangerously low altitudes without the same fear of a single lucky rifle shot bringing them down. Meanwhile, the Hawker Typhoon, originally designed as a high-speed interceptor, found its true calling as a rocket-armed tank destroyer carrying 8 RP-3 rockets, each with a warhead comparable an explosive power to a naval artillery shell, and while the accuracy of unguided rockets fired from a diving aircraft was far from perfect, the sheer volume of rocket-armed Typhoons unleashed against German columns meant that even a small percentage of hits could annihilate an entire convoy, and the psychological effect of watching rockets streak down from the sky, leaving trails of smoke before impacting with earth-shaking explosions, was often as devastating as the physical damage itself. What made these aircraft so uniquely terrifying to German tank crews was not simply their weaponry, but the operational reality of the summer of 1944, because by this point in the war, Allied air superiority over Normandy and northern France had become almost total. The Luftwaffe bled dry by years of attrition on the Eastern Front and decimated defending the skies over Germany itself, could offer little to no protection for German ground forces, meaning that any daytime movement by German armor was conducted under what amounted to a death sentence hanging in the sky. German tank commanders, who had grown accustomed to at least occasional air cover, or at minimum the ability to move during daylight hours with reasonable safety, now found themselves essentially blind and exposed the moment the sun rose, forced to treat every open road, every bridge crossing, and every assembly area as a potential killing ground. And this reality bred a particular kind of psychological exhaustion that differed fundamentally from the fear of artillery, because artillery fear was episodic, tied to specific bombardments that eventually ended. But the fear of fighter bombers was constant, omnipresent, a low hum of dread that accompanied every single movement during dialect, transforming simple logistics, resupply, and repositioning into nerve-wracking gambles with death. Surviving accounts from German officers who served in Normandy describe a battlefield discipline that emerged specifically to counter this aerial threat. Tank commanders began training their crews to listen constantly for the distinctive engine sounds of Allied fighters, the deep-throaty roar of a Thunderbolt's radial engine being distinguishable from other aircraft even at a distance, and the moment that sound was detected, standing orders across many units became immediate and absolute: stop the vehicle, abandon it if necessary, and scatter on foot into whatever cover was available: ditches, tree lines, farm buildings, anything that offered concealment from above, because a stationary, camouflaged tank tucked beneath trees presented a far harder target than the same tank moving in the open, and crews learned to accept the temporary abandonment of their vehicles as a survivable trade-off against the near certain destruction that continued movement under an active air threat would bring. Some accounts describe entire columns freezing in place at the first distant engine sound, drivers slamming vehicles into whatever concealment was nearest, sometimes crashing into ditches or damaging their own tanks in the panicked rush for cover, a telling detail that reveals just how thoroughly the psychological balance of power had shifted, because these were not green recruits panicking under fire for the first time. These were battle-hardened veterans of years of combat on multiple fronts, men who had faced Soviet T-34 assaults and endured artillery bombardments that would have broken lesser soldiers. Yet, the sound of an approaching fighter bomber engine could reduce even these veterans to scrambling for cover with an urgency that raw artillery fire rarely produced. Nowhere was this dynamic more brutally and completely demonstrated than in the Falaise Pocket during August 1944, an event that stands as perhaps the single most devastating example in the entire war of what happens when a retreating army loses control of the skies above its escape routes. By mid-August, the German 7th Army and remnants of the 5th Panzer Army found themselves nearly encircled by advancing Allied forces in a shrinking pocket of territory around the town of Falaise in Normandy, and as the noose tightened, German commanders faced an impossible choice: remain in the pocket and be destroyed by advancing ground forces, or attempt a breakout through the narrowing gap near the town of Chambois. And thousands of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, and support trucks, along with tens of thousands of soldiers, made the desperate decision to attempt escape through what became known as the Falaise Gap, a corridor that narrowed to just a few miles wide, congested beyond imagination with the retreating remnants of 2 entire armies. And it was here, on the roads leading through and around Falaise, that Allied air power achieved what may be its single most devastating demonstration of the entire European campaign, because Typhoon and Thunderbolt squadrons, operating in what pilots would later describe as almost unbelievable conditions of target abundance, found themselves presented with columns of German vehicles stretching for miles along roads with nowhere to hide, the congestion so severe that vehicles were often bumper to bumper, unable to disperse or take evasive action, trapped by their own numbers on roads too narrow and too crowded to allow the scattering that had saved so many crews in earlier encounters. And squadron after squadron of Allied aircraft descended upon these trapped columns, rockets tearing into masses of vehicles, cannon fire raking exposed infantry and unprotected transport, the destruction becoming so total that when Allied ground forces finally advanced through the pocket in the following days, they encountered scenes that even hardened combat veterans found difficult to process. Roads littered for miles with the burned-out husks of tanks, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons, the carcasses of thousands of horses used to pull German artillery pieces, and the simple, overwhelming evidence of an army that had been caught completely exposed and annihilated from above while attempting to flee. And while historians have since debated the exact proportion of destruction directly attributable to air attack versus ground artillery and armor in the final closing of the pocket, with some post-war analyses suggesting ground forces and artillery accounted for a significant share of destroyed vehicles found in the pocket, what remains undisputed is the overwhelming psychological impact that air attacks had on German forces attempting the breakout, because surviving soldiers and officers who escaped the pocket consistently described the aerial assault as the defining terror of the entire ordeal, an experience that shaped German operational thinking about air power for the remainder of the war far more than the raw, statistical tallies of destroyed vehicles might suggest. The trauma of watching comrades die from an enemy they could not shoot back at, could not shelter from with any reliability, and could not predict, leaving a mark that transcended simple casualty figures. This trauma translated directly into a fundamental shift in German tactical doctrine that would persist for the remainder of the war in the West, because German commanders, recognizing that daylight movement of any significant armored or motorized force had become effectively suicidal in areas of Allied air superiority, increasingly mandated that major troop movements, resupply convoys, and repositioning of armor take place exclusively under cover of darkness, a shift that carried enormous operational costs, because night movement was inherently slower and more dangerous. Even without enemy action, vehicles had to navigate unfamiliar roads with minimal lighting to avoid detection. Accidents and breakdowns increased, and the physical and mental exhaustion of crews forced to operate on inverted schedules, moving by night and attempting to rest, camouflage, and hide by day, accumulated over weeks and months into a chronic degradation of combat effectiveness And this doctrine of nocturnal movement also fundamentally altered the tempo of German military operations, because commanders could no longer respond to battlefield developments with the same flexibility. A crisis requiring reinforcement during daylight hours might have to wait for darkness before reserves could safely move to respond, granting Allied forces a strategic initiative that compounded with every passing day. And German engineers and logisticians developed increasingly elaborate camouflage techniques to protect vehicles during required daylight halts. Tanks were draped in nets woven with foliage. Convoys were dispersed and hidden beneath tree cover with almost obsessive attention to concealment. And drivers were trained to identify and utilize even minor terrain features, sunken roads, building shadows, orchard rows, anything that might break up the distinctive silhouette of military vehicles from aerial observation, a level of tactical adaptation that speaks volumes about how seriously German forces had come to regard the aerial threat. This was not occasional caution, but a comprehensive reorganization of how an entire military machine conducted itself, born from hard experience and the accumulated trauma of watching fighter bombers dismantle armored formations that had proven capable of standing against the Soviet and other Allied ground forces. It's worth understanding why this fear of aircraft proved so much more corrosive to morale than artillery, even though, in raw destructive terms, sustained artillery bombardment often inflicted greater aggregate damage across the war as a whole. And the answer lies partly in the sense of agency and control that soldiers could exercise against each threat. Against artillery, a crew member could dig deeper, build stronger overhead cover, learn to read incoming rounds and take appropriate action. There existed a body of soldierly knowledge and skill that, while not eliminating risk, at least offered some sense of influence over one's own survival. But against fighter bombers, particularly in an environment of total Allied air superiority, there was remarkably little a tank crew could do beyond hiding and hoping not to be spotted. German tanks of the period generally lacked adequate anti-aircraft weaponry mounted directly on the vehicles themselves, relying instead on separate flak units for air defense, units that were often overwhelmed, poorly coordinated with armored formations, or simply not present in sufficient numbers to provide meaningful protection, meaning that an individual tank crew caught in the open by fighter bombers had essentially no means of fighting back, no way to actively defend themselves, only the passive hope that camouflage or luck would keep them from being the target selected in that particular pass. And this fundamental powerlessness, the inability to influence one's own fate through skill or courage or aggressive action, struck at something deeper than simple fear of death. It struck at the soldierly identity itself, at the sense that competence and experience could improve one's odds of survival, and when that sense of agency was stripped away, replaced by pure passive vulnerability, the psychological toll proved far heavier than raw casualty statistics alone would suggest. The broader strategic consequences of this fear extended well beyond individual engagements or even the catastrophe at Falaise, because the cumulative effect of Allied air superiority on German operational capability throughout the Normandy campaign and the subsequent retreat across France represented one of the clearest demonstrations in military history of how control of the air could paralyze and degrade even a highly capable ground army. German Panzer divisions, formations that had demonstrated remarkable tactical skill and fighting power in numerous engagements against Allied ground forces throughout the Normandy campaign, found their strategic mobility severely constrained, not primarily through direct combat losses in armored engagements, but through the accumulated friction of forced night movement, fuel and ammunition resupply operations rendered dangerous and unreliable, and the psychological exhaustion of crews operating under constant threat of sudden aerial death, and German commanders, including experienced officers who had led armored formations across multiple theaters of the war, explicitly acknowledge it in post-war analysis and interrogations that Allied air power represented perhaps the single greatest factor in the German defeat in France, more significant in many respects than the raw numerical or even qualitative advantages of Allied ground forces, because it was air power that determined when and how German forces could move, resupply, and reinforce, effectively dictating the operational tempo of the entire campaign to Allied advantage, even in situations where German ground forces might have otherwise been capable of more effective resistance. And this recognition would go on to influence military thinking about the relationship between air and ground power for decades following the war, contributing to doctrines of combined arms warfare that placed unprecedented emphasis on achieving and maintaining air superiority as a prerequisite for successful ground operations. As Allied forces pushed German troops back toward the German border in the autumn of 1944, the lessons learned in France about the vulnerability of armor to fighter-bomber attack were not forgotten by either side. German forces continued their adaptation, developing more sophisticated dispersal and camouflage techniques, and increasingly relying on the cover of poor weather conditions, understanding that overcast skies and fog, conditions that grounded or severely hampered Allied air operations, provided rare windows of relative safety for significant troop movements, a dynamic that would notably influence German planning for the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, where commanders specifically chose to launch their attack during a period of poor weather forecast to limit Allied air support, a direct tactical response to the hard lessons learned during the terrible summer of aerial destruction across France, demonstrating just how deeply the fear of fighter bombers had become embedded in German operational planning at the highest levels, no longer simply a matter of individual crew survival, but a factor shaping entire campaign strategies. The story of German tank crews and their dread of Allied fighter bombers ultimately reveals something profound about the nature of modern warfare that had crystallized by the final years of the Second World War, that raw firepower alone, however devastating, does not necessarily produce the deepest psychological impact on soldiers facing it, but rather the combination of unpredictability, the absence of any meaningful defensive recourse, and the sense of being hunted by an intelligent, seeing enemy rather than simply enduring impersonal bombardment, creates a uniquely corrosive form of battlefield fear, one that can degrade not just individual courage, but the operational effectiveness of entire military formations. And the Panzer crews, who once feared little on the battlefields of Poland, France, and Russia, who had faced Soviet artillery of terrifying intensity and endured years of brutal combat across multiple fronts found in the skis over Normandy, an enemy against which their courage, their experience, and their tactical skill offered remarkably little protection. And in that vulnerability lies perhaps the truest measure of how completely the balance of power in the war had shifted by the summer of 1944, not merely in numbers of tanks or guns, but in something less tangible and ultimately more decisive: control of the ski itself, and the fear that control instilled in even the most battle-hardened men who found themselves staring upward, frozen, listening for the sound of engines that meant death was about to fall from a sky they no longer owned.